So today we're tackling restricted entry intervals, REIs, for pesticide-treated areas.
Exactly. We're diving into the official guidelines. Basically, an REI is just that stay-out time after a pesticide application.
Right, to keep workers safe.
Yeah, keeps them safe from exposure. And you find that time period right on the pesticide label itself, usually under agricultural use requirements in the directions for use section.
Or sometimes right next to the crop listed.
Sometimes, yeah, or the specific application method. It varies a bit.
Okay.
As you've just been hearing, the REI is listed on the pesticide labeling under the heading Agricultural Use Requirements in the Directions for Use section of the pesticide labeling or next to the crop or application method to which it applies.
So our mission today really is to untangle the rules for when workers can go back in before that official REI is up. Because the basic rule is stay out, but there are exceptions.
There are, and that's where it gets tricky. So we want to make that clear. It's super important for farm safety.
Absolutely.
Early entry with no contact. Early entry with contact for short-term, emergency, or specially accepted task, which must comply with additional restrictions. Entry into treated areas during an REI is allowed to perform handling tasks as long as the persons entering such areas are trained and equipped as pesticide handlers and receive all other applicable WPS handler protections.
So lay it out for us. What's the employer's main job here?
Okay, fundamentally, the employer must keep workers out during the REI. That's the baseline.
The exceptions.
Right. But there are basically two main ways workers can enter early. First, if they will have absolutely zero contact with any pesticide residue. None.
Okay, zero contact. What's the second?
The second is for very specific situations where some contact might happen, but the work itself is really limited and controlled.
Gotcha.
And we should also just mention, trained and equipped pesticide handlers operate under different rules when they're actually doing handler tasks. Agricultural workers.
Okay, let's dig into that first one then. Early entry with no contact. What's the absolute bottom line?
The core idea is, like I said, workers can go in only if they won't touch any pesticide residue at all.
And where might that residue be hiding? It's not just on the plants, right?
No, definitely not. It could be on the crops, sure, but also weeds. It could be in or on the soil or potting mix, whatever they're using.
Okay.
Also think about water, irrigation water, even puddles on the ground. And the air itself, especially after fumigation or, fogs or mists before everything settles.
Okay. So it's pretty comprehensive.
Once again, I want to reiterate, where could these residues be hiding? They could be on plants, including both agricultural plants and weeds, on or in soil or planting medium, in water, such as irrigation water, or water standing in drainage ditches or puddles, in air. If pesticide remains suspended after application, such as after fumigation or after a smoke, mist, fog, or aerosol application.
And I noticed a key point in the guidance, just wearing PPE, like gloves or boots, doesn't count as no contact here, does it?
No, absolutely not. That's crucial. Using PPE doesn't magically make it no contact for this specific exception. The whole point here is avoiding the contact in the first place.
Right.
Avoiding contact by using personal protective equipment does not qualify as no contact early entry. No contact early entry workers do not have to be provided the special protections required for other early entry workers. The following are examples of situations where a worker would not be expected to contact pesticide residues in a treated area after sprays, dust, and vapors have settled out of the air.
So what are some real-world examples where this no contact entry would actually be okay after sprays or dusts have settled, obviously?
Well, think about someone walking down aisles or pathways, like established farm roads or footpaths within the treated area, as long as the plants aren't going to brush against them and nothing's dripping on them.
And they just wear normal work boots.
Yep, standard footwear is fine for that. No special PPE needed for this exception.
Okay, what else?
Being inside a vehicle can work. But again, the key is no plants brushing against the vehicle, nothing tripping into it.
Like a tractor with a closed cab.
Exactly. An enclosed cab is a perfect example.
So again, in situations where the worker is wearing footwear and is walking in aisles or on roads, footpaths, or other pathways through the treated area where the plants or other treated surfaces cannot brush against the worker and cannot drop or drip pesticides onto the worker, we wouldn't expect them to come into contact with the pesticides. Again, as we just talked about, if the worker is in a vehicle in a treated area where the plants cannot brush against the worker and cannot drop or drip pesticides onto the worker. So obviously, if the worker's in a vehicle, there's a lot more protection from these types of issues occurring.
What if the pesticide was put directly into the soil, like injected?
Good question. If it was incorporated or injected, then you can do some tasks, but only if you're not disturbing that treated soil below the surface.
So, no digging.
Right. No digging, no turning the soil over, and again, driving through in a totally enclosed cab where no residue gets in, that works too.
Got it. So no contact means absolutely zero physical interaction. And the big advantage is these workers don't need all that extra protective gear required for other early entry situations.
So again, this would be another scenario where workers wouldn't be expected to contact pesticides after a pesticide application that is incorporated or injected into the soil. The worker is doing tasks that do not involve touching or disrupting the soil subsurface. So at that point, after that pesticide has been incorporated or injected into that soil, there's going to be a lot lower risk that that person or anybody entering that area would contact the pesticide. That doesn't mean you don't need to wear PPE. That's just saying that there's no reason why a worker would contact these pesticides when they're doing tasks that don't involve touching or disrupting that soil subsurface. And of course, when the worker is driving through the treated area in an enclosed cab on a truck, tractor, or other vehicle that prevents occupants from contacting pesticide residues or pesticide-treated surfaces. Once again, you're inside that cab. The risk of you touching these pesticides should be pretty low. I'm going to reiterate, that does not mean you don't wear the proper PPE. That's just saying that your chances of coming into contact with a pesticide are much, much less when you're in one of these enclosed cabs.
That's a really important distinction, because if any contact is expected, even a little bit, well, then a whole different set of rules applies, much stricter.
Which brings us to that second category, early entry with contact.
Exactly. Early entry where contact might happen.
So when is it okay for workers to touch treated surfaces during an REI? It sounds like it's pretty rare.
It is. It's only allowed in very specific, limited situations. The guidelines basically break it down into three main types.
Okay, what are they?
First, short-term tasks. These have to be less than 1 hour total, and they cannot involve anything defined as hand labor.
Hand labor. Okay, we'll need to define that. What's the second thing?
Second is emergency tasks. Stuff that has to be done because there's been an officially declared agricultural emergency.
Okay, like a natural disaster?
Sort of, yeah. We'll get into specifics. And the third category is specific tasks that the EPA itself has approved through a special exception process.
So it's really important for you to know there are situations where early entry with potential contact can be okay. What are the work situations where early entry is allowed? Early entry involving contact with pesticide-treated surfaces is permitted in only the following work situations. 1. Short-term tasks that last less than 1 hour and do not involve hand labor. 2. Emergency tasks that take place because of emergency tasks that take place because of an agricultural emergency. And 3. Specific tasks approved by the EPA through a formal exception process. Let's think about some of those immediate tasks. Manual labor encompasses any farming activity conducted by hand or using handheld tools, which may result in significant contact with surfaces, such as plants, plant components, or soil that could harbor pesticide residues.
Okay, 3 categories. Let's circle back to hand labor. You said short-term tasks can't involve it. What exactly is hand labor according to these rules? Sounds critical.
It really is. Hand labor is basically any farm work done by hand, or maybe with handheld tools, where you're likely to have significant contact with those treated surfaces, the plants, the soil, whatever.
Can you give some examples?
Oh yeah, the list is long. Things like packing produce out in the field, harvesting fruits or vegetables by hand, detasseling corn, thinning out crops, weeding by hand.
Wow, okay. Keep going.
Topping plants, planting by hand, girdling trees, cane work, removing suckers, pruning, disbudding flowers, roguing that's pulling out diseased or unwanted plants, all that stuff.
That covers a huge amount of common farm work.
As you can imagine, to follow the label, we need to understand what these hand labor tasks are. They can include packing produce into containers in the field, harvesting, detasseling, thinning, weeding, topping, planting, girdling, caning, sucker removal, pruning, disbudding, and roguing. This is a pretty reasonable and comprehensive list of what will be included in hand labor. So again, if you're doing any of these types of things, this is going to be considered hand labor for label purposes.
But what's explicitly not hand labor, I saw a note about irrigation equipment.
Right, good catch. Operating, moving, or fixing irrigation or watering equipment, that is specifically not considered hand labor.
Okay, that's a key difference.
It is. And actually, those irrigation tasks can sometimes fall under one of those EPA-approved exceptions we mentioned.
Ah, interesting. Okay.
And we want to note here, the definition of hand labor does not include operating, moving, or repairing irrigation or watering equipment. These tasks can be performed during the REI, but only under approved situations with proper, early entry, personal protective equipment, PPE.
So before we get to the EPA stuff, tell me more about the agricultural emergency tasks. What counts as an emergency here? It can't just be like, my tractor broke down.
No, definitely not just a breakdown. For this exception, a state, tribal, or even a federal agency has to officially declare an agricultural emergency exists.
An official declaration.
Yes, based on conditions that exist or have happened or are even forecast that pose a real threat to agriculture in the area. Think big things. Major flooding, hail damage, high winds, hurricane, tornado, a bad freeze or frost.
Got it. So major widespread events.
And once again, these emergency tasks are going to be something a state or tribal or federal agency must declare that circumstances exist, have occurred, or are forecasts that might cause an agricultural emergency where your establishment is located. Examples of such circumstances include flooding, hail, high winds, hurricane, tornado, freeze, or frost. You need to stay on top of this, and you need to understand how to keep up with when a state, tribal, or federal agency declares that these circumstances exist. Then you'll have a better understanding of how these emergency tasks affect the REI at that time. So when we look at these specific tasks with regulatory exemption, EPA has approved 2 specific tasks for early entry through EPA's formal regulatory exemption process. 1, limited contact tasks that could not have been foreseen, cannot be delayed, and do not involve hand labor. 2, irrigation tasks that cannot be delayed, involve limited contact with treated surfaces, and that will take more than 1 hour in the REI area to perform.
What about those EPA-approved specific tasks? You said there were 2 types.
Yeah, 2 main types under that umbrella. The first is called limited contact tasks.
Limited contact, okay.
These are tasks that couldn't have been predicted, they really can't wait, and here's that key phrase again, they do not involve hand labor.
No hand labor. Got it.
Now let's think about limited contact tasks. These limited contact tasks are tasks where early entry workers only contact with treated surfaces, including soil, water, surfaces of plants, crops, and any equipment, is minimal and is limited to their feet, lower legs, hands, and forearms. Hand labor tasks are not limited contact tasks. Examples of limited contact tasks are operating or repairing weather monitoring and frost protection equipment, repairing greenhouse heating, air conditioning, and ventilation equipment, repairing non-application and non-irrigation field equipment, maintaining and moving beehives.
And what does limited contact mean?
It means contact is minimal, and it's restricted just to the worker's feet, their lower legs, hams, and forearms. That's it.
So not getting residue all over their body.
Exactly. And just to be super clear, none of those hand labor tasks we listed earlier, harvesting, weeding, pruning, none of those count as limited contact tasks.
Okay. What are some examples then of these allowed limited contact tasks?
Think about things like fixing essential weather monitoring gear, or maybe frost protection equipment right when a sudden freeze is coming.
Okay, time-sensitive stuff.
Right, or repairing the HVAC system in a greenhouse, if it breaks unexpectedly. Fixing other field equipment too, as long as it's not application or irrigation gear. Oh, and moving or maintaining beehives falls in here too.
Interesting. Beehives. Okay, so that's limited contact.
Irrigation tasks are tasks related to operating, moving, or repairing irrigation or watering equipment, and where early entry workers only contact with treated surfaces, including soil, water, surfaces of plants, crops, and irrigation equipment, is minimal and is limited to their feet, lower legs, hands, and forearms.
What was the second type of EPA-approved task?
That one is specifically irrigation tasks.
Back to the irrigation equipment.
Exactly. This covers the necessary work of operating, moving, or repairing irrigation or watering systems. Like the limited contact tasks, these jobs can't be delayed, and they only involve that same minimal contact feet, lower legs, hands, forearms.
So what makes them different from the limited contact category then?
The key difference is time. These specific irrigation tasks are ones that are expected to take more than 1 hour inside that REI area to get done.
Okay, because the short-term tasks we mentioned first had that 1 hour cap.
Precisely. So this carves out an exception for those necessary longer irrigation jobs.
Makes sense.
Under what conditions is early entry allowed for these work situations? There are specific conditions that must be met for early entry for short-term task, limited contact task, irrigation task, and agricultural emergency task.
Okay, so for all these situations where contact might happen short-term, limited contact, irrigation, and emergencies, there are specific conditions that have to be met, right?
Let's take a look at when early entry can be allowed based on conditions and task. If we look at our first condition, wait at least 4 hours after pesticide application is completed, early entry may be allowed for short-term task, limited contact task, irrigation task, and agricultural emergency task. Now, when our condition involves waiting until inhalation exposure level on the pesticide label has been reached or any WPS ventilation criteria have been met, we can early enter with short-term task, limited contact task, irrigation task, and agricultural emergency task. When our condition is the maximum amount of time allowed per 24 hours has been spent in the area, we can early enter with a short-term task limited to 1 hour, a limited contact task limited to 8 hours, irrigation task limited to 8 hours, and no limit on agricultural emergencies. In our next condition where early entry can be allowed for pesticides whose labeling requires double notification, verbal notification, and posting signs. If we look at short-term task, yes, allowed for all WPS pesticides. If we look at limited contact task, no, there is no early entry allowed. If we look at irrigation task, no, there is no early entry allowed. And for agricultural emergencies, yes, early entry can be allowed for all WPS pesticides. Again, on this chart, we're looking at conditions where early entry may be allowed. In our first condition, are hand labor tasks permitted? For short-term tasks, the answer would be no. For limited contact task, the answer would be no. For irrigation tasks, the answer would be no. For agricultural emergency tasks, yes, but must be related to the ag emergency. In our next condition, where early entry may be allowed, employer provides special protections for early entry workers regarding training, instructions, decontamination supplies, and personal protective equipment PPE. For short-term tasks, the answer is yes. For limited contact tasks, the answer is yes. For irrigation task, the answer is yes. And for agricultural emergency tasks, the answer is yes, early entry is allowed. In the next condition where early entry may be allowed, need for entry could not have been anticipated. So early entry for short-term tasks in this scenario doesn't matter. For limited contact tasks, early entry is allowed only if need could not have been foreseen. Also with irrigation tasks, early entry is only allowed if need could not have been foreseen. And early entry may be allowed under this condition for agricultural emergency tasks only if circumstances could not have been anticipated when pesticide was applied. And our final condition where early entry might be allowed, entry is not an economic necessity. If we're looking at early entry being allowed on these, with short-term tasks, it doesn't matter. With limited contact tasks, only if delay would cause significant economic loss. With irrigation tasks, only if delay would cause significant economic loss. And with agricultural emergency tasks, early entry is only practiced to prevent or reduce a substantial economic loss.
I saw a table in the guidance.
Yes, absolutely. There's a set of conditions, and they vary slightly depending on the type of entry. Let's walk through some key ones.
Okay. First off, there's a minimum wait time after application, isn't there? Like even for these exceptions.
Yes. Across the board, short-term, limited contact, irrigation, emergency. You always have to wait at least 4 hours after the pesticide application is totally finished.
4 hours minimum. Got it. And what about breathing risks? Inhalation.
Also consistent. You have to wait until any inhalation exposure level listed on the label is met, or if there are specific worker protection standard WPS ventilation rules, those have to be met too.
Okay, WPS ventilation criteria. Good point. Now, how long can workers actually be in the treated area? Does that change?
It does. For those short-term tasks, it's a strict maximum of 1 hour in any 24-hour period.
Just 1 hour.
Yep. But for limited contact tasks and for those irrigation tasks, the limit goes up to 8 hours per 24 hours.
8 hours. Okay. And for emergencies?
Interestingly, for a declared agricultural emergency, there's actually no specified time limit for how long the early entry work can take.
Huh. Okay. What about those pesticides that need double notification, like warning signs and telling people verbally? Does that affect early entry?
It can, yes. For short-term tasks and for emergency entry, you can still go in even if it's a double notification pesticide.
Okay.
However, for limited contact tasks and for irrigation tasks, early entry is not allowed if that pesticide requires both posted signs and oral warnings.
Ah, that's a key restriction for those two categories. Now, the big question, hand labor. Is it ever allowed during these contact possible early entries?
Only, and I mean only in the case of a declared agricultural emergency. And even then, the hand labor has to be directly related to fixing the emergency situation.
So definitely no hand labor for short-term limited contact or irrigation tasks.
Absolutely forbidden for those.
And what about safety gear and procedures? Do employers have to provide special protections for all these types of contact entry?
Yes, for all 4 short-term limited contact, irrigation, and emergency. If workers are entering early and might have contact, the employer must provide specific protections.
Okay, always required. Good. Now, the table also mentions something about whether the need for entry was foreseeable. Does that matter?
It does for some. For short-term tasks, it doesn't really matter if you could have predicted the need or not.
Okay.
But for limited contact, irrigation, and emergency entry, the need generally should not have been anticipated. It reinforces that these are exceptions for, unexpected stuff.
Right. Not for routine planned work during an REI. And the last point in the table was about economic necessity.
Yeah. Again, for short-term tasks, it's not a factor. But for limited contact and irrigation tasks, early entry is only okay if not doing the work would cause significant economic loss.
Okay, a financial justification.
Right. And for agricultural emergencies, it's basically allowed if early entry is the only practical way to stop or reduce major economic losses caused by that emergency.
Wow, okay. That breakdown really shows how many layers there are to these exceptions.
And that brings us to our next important point. What are the special protections for early entry workers? Worker employers must provide the following additional protections to early entry workers who contact anything that has been treated with a pesticide. Complete pesticide safety training, instructions, and information, decontamination supplies, personal protective equipment, PPE.
So let's get into those special protections you mentioned. What exactly does an employer have to provide for these early entry workers who might have contact?
Okay, several critical things. First, they need full pesticide safety training, specific instructions for the task, and all the relevant safety info.
And we need to look at training and instruction. Employers must make sure each early entry worker is trained as a WPS worker before entering a pesticide-treated area during an REI. The 5-day grace period for training that applies to other workers does not apply to early entry workers. Employers must instruct early entry workers in a manner they can understand. How to put on, use, and take off early entry PPE correctly, about the importance of washing thoroughly after removing PPE, how to prevent, recognize, and give correct first aid for heat illness, too much heat stress.
And this is super important, that normal 5-day grace period for training workers. It does not apply here.
So they need the training before they go in?
Absolutely. Before setting foot in that area for early entry work. No exceptions.
Makes total sense. What kind of specific instructions do they need?
The employer has to tell them, in a way they understand, exactly how to put on, use, and take off the required PPE correctly.
Okay.
They also have to stress how important it is to wash thoroughly after taking the PPE off. And critically, they need info on preventing heat illness, how to spot it, what the symptoms are, and basic first aid for it.
Yeah, heat illness is a big risk, especially wearing PPE.
Employers must inform early entry workers in a manner they can understand about the safety information and instructions on the labeling of the pesticide to which the REI applies, including human hazard statements and precautions, first aid, signs and symptoms of poisoning, PPE required for early entry, any other precautions or instructions related to safe use or early entry.
What about info from the pesticide label itself?
Also required. The employer has to communicate the key safety stuff from the label. Human hazard warnings, first aid steps, signs and symptoms of poisoning for that specific chemical, exactly what PPE is needed for early entry, and any other safety rules on that label.
So really thorough communication is key. What about the decontamination supplies? What needs to be available?
Right, decon supplies. Employers have to provide enough clean water for routine washing and for emergency eye flushing. Plus, soap and single-use towels. Enough for everyone.
Decontamination supplies. Worker employers must provide early entry workers with water, enough for routine washing and emergency eye flushing, soap and single-use towels, enough for the needs of early entry workers. Employers must make sure that the decontamination supplies are not in an area being treated with pesticides, are not in an area under an REI unless that location is necessary for the supplies to be reasonably accessible to early entry workers, are reasonably accessible to and not more than 1/4 mile from early entry workers.
Where do these supplies need to be?
Good question. They can't be in the area being treated, obviously, and ideally not in an area still under REI, unless, that's the only way to make them accessible.
Accessible. How close is accessible?
The rule is reasonably accessible, which they define as within 1/4 mile of where the early entry workers are.
1/4 mile. Okay.
A worker employer must provide each early entry worker with at least 1 pint of emergency eye flush water when the pesticide labeling requires protective eyewear. The emergency eye flush water must be immediately accessible. At the site where early entry workers take off their PPE, the worker employer must provide soap, clean towels, and enough water to allow early entry workers to wash thoroughly after removing their PPE.
What about specifically for eye washing?
If the pesticide label requires protective eyewear, then the employer has to provide at least a pint of emergency eye wash water for each worker. And it has to be immediately accessible right where they are.
Immediately accessible. Got it.
And one more thing on washing where they take off their PPE. There needs to be soap, clean towels, and enough water right there for them to wash thoroughly.
Okay. Comprehensive decon setup.
PPE for early entry workers. Employers must provide their early entry workers with the early entry PPE required by the pesticide labeling, Make sure they wear the PPE and make sure they use the PPE correctly.
And the last piece of the protection puzzle is the PPE itself.
Exactly. The employer must provide the specific early entry PPE that's listed on the pesticide label, period.
They just provide it.
Provide it and make sure the workers actually wear it and wear it correctly while doing the task. Just handing it out isn't enough. They have to ensure proper use.
Wow. Okay. This has been incredibly detailed. We've really unpacked REIs and especially these complex exceptions.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot to keep track of.
So for everyone listening, trying to get this right, I guess the main takeaway is that dealing with these REI exceptions needs real care, real attention to detail.
Absolutely. You have to look closely at the type of entry, exactly what task needs doing, and then follow all the mandatory safety steps if there's any chance of contact.
And always, always go back to that pesticide label. That's your primary guide for the REI length and any specific early entry PPE.
Couldn't agree more. Understanding those specifics is vital, not just for staying compliant, but really for protecting the health and safety of the people doing the work.
Congratulations, you have completed the course. Please proceed to the exam to receive your credit.